Hello all, my name is Juan Ramón Moreno-Vera and I'm a professor at the University of Murcia in Spain. I'm going to develop this teaching module called ITC and Digital Resources to Teach History, which is part of the European funded project HistoryLab for European Civic Engagement. As introduction, we can say that the presence of ITC resources in our history lesson have to respond positively to the actual needs of society. So we have to reflect that our students deal daily with these ITC resources and social media, and it's important that we reflect that also in our school system. But we have to make a correct use of ITC resources because ITC resources, they are not the target. Our target is to make our students to learn history. So we have to reflect and design correctly our activities with ITC resources, and we have to reflect about that TPAC framework, which is the perfect combination when designing activities among the technology we want to use for the correct content we want our students to learn, but at the same time is the correct technology for the cognitive capacities and pedagogical capacities of our students. In this sense, the use of ITC resources in history education could have multiple benefits. For example, will improve our students when working cooperatively, and also will improve the communication and dissemination of the research that they are going to make through research method, using digital libraries and archives to find new historical evidences and sources, being critical with them, using other active learning methods as project-based learning or service learning or flipped classroom or gamification that will for sure increase our students' motivation for our history lessons. I'm going to develop some examples and applications of ITC resources, but it's important for me to remind you that all the contents of these presentations are included also in the document of that is in this online module in the content document, but at the same time the links of these applications I'm going to talk about, they are included in the document called complementary sources, also in this online module. So I'm going to start with the creation of virtual classrooms, which is the creation of a digital community among teachers and students through these kind of applications as wikis or Moodle that are interconnected web pages to organize contents. It's very helpful for us as teachers, as they will facilitate communications among teachers and students, but also among students themselves, and they will allow us to use different sources and materials, text, documents, videos, audios, or even to make our students to complete our activities. It's going to be also using text creators as Google Docs, for example, or blogs like Blogger or WordPress, or also comic creators as Powtoons, because we can use that kind of resources for our students as personal and individual diaries. So our students could reflect everything they are learning in our lessons through these blogs and diaries, and at the same time they can build their own knowledge. And it's important the use of that kind of blogs and text creators to help our students to disseminate the findings of their research, also for example with the families, and it's a good way to involve the families in the teaching and learning process. In terms of sharing and disseminating the findings of the research methods that we are going to implement with our students, we can also use social media as Twitter or Instagram. They will improve communication and dissemination of results, but at the same time, we as teachers, we can be in part of that informal education. And also it's going to be important for us as teachers that we can promote that democratic participation of our students or democratic values among our students through social media. It's another way to make our students to create their own knowledge, and it's going to be very important for us, is the use of some podcast application like Anchor or video channels as YouTube, because they are going to be perfect if we want to implement new strategies, as for example flipped classroom. And it's also going to be important if we want to expand some contents and adaptate that content to the different necessities of our students. So in case of that some students want to know more about some topic, we can also extend that kind of information through our videos in YouTube or in our podcast. Another tool that is going to be very interesting is the use of e-portfolio. In this case, it's going to be very similar to a blog because our students can use the e-portfolio as a personal diary. But the interesting thing is that we as teachers, we can link that results and activities directly with our evaluation criteria. So it's going to be a very powerful resource if we want to evaluate our history lessons. We can also use in history classes presentations, as I am doing right now, for example, with a PowerPoint presentation, and also infographics like Canva or Genially. It's going to be a good way to make a different organization of contents, and also at the same time to include new and invisible contents that perhaps they are not appearing correctly in our textbooks. But also, for example, the use of infographics through Canva or Genially is going to be very powerful because they are very visual, and we could ask our students to sum up the contents they are learning through this kind of posters or infographics. In a similar way, we can use also mental maps, for example, the application CMap Tools. It will be interesting because our students could establish some hierarchy and relationships through different historical contents. And it's also a powerful resource because it's at the same time visual and written. And we can use this kind of mental maps both as to detect, for example, prior knowledge of our students, but also to summarize the contents that they are learning in our lessons. Something very similar to organize content is going to be the use of online timelines, for example, Time Toast. And in this case, obviously, we are going to organize our contents chronologically, which is something very interesting in terms of history education. But at the same time, for example, it's going to be very useful to expand information because in these online timelines, we can include videos, audios, pictures, or artworks, for example. And it's going to be a very powerful resource if we want to explain our students some difficult and complex concepts in terms of historical thinking competencies, as could be change and continuity, historical relevance, duration, diachrony, or the simultaneity of some historical events. We also can use some historical maps and digital maps at, for example, Google Earth, Google Maps, or Geachron. It's obvious that the use of maps as a didactic tool is maybe more related to geography than to history, but it's going to be also important in terms of history education to use maps as a way to make a correct space and time contextualization of the events. And also at the same time, the use of historical maps that, for example, are included in Google Earth, it's going to permit us to explain that competency of historical perspective or historical empathy. So our students using all maps are going to understand how historical character at the time understood the world and the space. We can also use, for example, some ITC resources related to mobile devices as a smartphone or tablets. For example, QR codes. QR codes are very interesting because they allow our students to research and generate their own contents, for example, through a blog, and then linking that blog with the QR code, which is a very good way to disseminate and share the new findings and contents. We can use the QR codes to include different historical sources for our students, our video, documents, text, or artworks, for example. It's going to be very useful also if we want to expand information of our textbooks or in our presentations. And it's going to be especially important and interesting if we are planning or designing some kind of didactic visit or didactic itinerary in our town, in our city, to a museum or to some kind of monument, because we can plan some stops in the visit, and with the QR code we can include activities to develop during that visit. We can also use another type of codes, for example, virtual and augmented reality codes. In terms of augmented reality codes, they are going to be very useful. For example, if we want to reconstruct historical context or historical buildings, for example. And also it's going to be very interesting if we want to use virtual reality, although it's something that is now starting in terms of history education, because we can share some virtual reality videos with our students and allow them to be part of that historical events. We can also use, although it's again in the starting levels, the use of robotics in terms of history education. For example, Lego education is perfect if we want to make our students to understand some historical inventions. But at the same time, we can use applications like the Vbot you are seeing now in the presentation, which is a small educative bot, and we can give the bot some kind of orders through computational thinking, and it's going to be something perfect if we want to implement some gamification in our classrooms, to create some cardboard games or to create some itineraries inside our classroom. And the last but not least important ITC resources I'm going to develop is the digital libraries, which is something very important if we want to make our students to investigate and research in our classes, being active and acting like a historian. So we have to promote our students to be historians in our classes, to get new historical evidences and sources, being critical with them, but also being creative with the works and investigations they are developing in our classes. As conclusion of this presentation, it's obvious that ITC resources, ITC is just a tool, it's not the target of our lessons, because as I mentioned before, the target of our lessons is to make the students learn history. The use of ITC resources is just a tool, a resource to help and to improve as teachers, to improve the implementation of new methodologies as research method, project-based learning, gamification, flipped classroom, service learning, and they are going to be very useful if we want to implement that kind of new strategies. And finally, it's going to be very important the use of ITC resources if we want to promote research and also to develop that historical thinking competencies among our students. It's not just that we are going to make our students memorize history. So if not, that we want our students to understand history and think historically, and that is something very important that we could make through these ITC and technological resources in terms of history education. Thank you so much.